The rise of increasingly capable and sophisticated AI-based tools is fundamentally reshaping how we work, creating unparalleled challenges and opportunities. But while a substantial portion of human work may be taken over by machines, our most human capabilities will become increasingly important and valuable. In my work and research with organisations at the forefront of AI integration, I've seen leaders continue to grapple with this reality. How do we harness AI's potential while preserving human value? How can we integrate these powerful tools without losing the human touch? How do we lead through uncertainty while maintaining team cohesion and performance? This keynote cuts through the noise to present a human-centric vision for the future of work, moving beyond the extremes of technological pessimism and naive optimism. I'll share practical strategies drawn from cutting-edge research and real-world implementations that address the human performance and technological implications of a new world of work, characterized by powerful AI employee alliances. Capabilities such as complex problem solving, collaboration, creativity, they will not be expressed at their best with our current ways of living and working. Perhaps the real danger isn't that machines and artificial intelligence are going to start working more like humans. It's that we humans will keep trying to work like machines. We can't always be on. We need more human rhythms of work and rest, being clear about where to focus effort, knowing when to rest, finding and following our own rhythm. Optimize. Don't maximize. The potential of navigating this transition successfully is remarkable. Organizations effectively leveraging AI tools see up to 79% improvements in employee productivity while reducing stress and enhancing job satisfaction. You'll discover proven frameworks for transforming AI-related fears into opportunities for growth, learn specific steps for integration that amplify rather than replace human capabilities, and develop robust strategies for leading through technological uncertainty. Most importantly, you'll gain a clear roadmap for creating a workplace where technology enhances rather than depletes human capability. In the future of work, it's estimated that some of these generative AI tools might reduce our working hours by 30%. Unsurprisingly, 49% of people worry that AI might replace them. Yet, 70% of people still would like to delegate as much work as possible. My question to you today is this: if this future really evolves as we anticipate it might, could we invest some of that extra time in periods of deliberate focus, proactive rest, and adequate sleep? Together, we'll explore how to build an organisation that not only survives the AI revolution but thrives through it by working in harmony rather than in opposition with our humanity.
Good evening, everybody. Well, it is fantastic to be here with you this evening. You might have heard already, my name is James Hewitt, and I am a human performance scientist. You know, I'm fascinated by the intersection of 4 different topics: leadership, well-being, peak performance, and the future of work. I was so intrigued by these topics, in fact, I decided to do a PhD in the middle too, the relationship between well-being and performance in the workplace. But you know, there's a challenge for many of us, because well-being and performance, rather than feeling like they're complementary, all too often for many of us, it feels like they're in conflict. I'm sure that many of you might relate to some of these statistics. You know, for too many people, rather than well-being and performance feeling complementary, it feels like they're working harder and faster than ever before. You know, there's some great data that we can capture from how people use their software, sending emails, using word processing, making presentations, if you're in my job, for example. And when you pull that data, it seems that over the last couple of years, working hours have increased by 13%. What's more, even though we're working longer than ever, 64% of people still don't feel like they've got enough time to get their work done. Well, I've got some good news for you today. It doesn't have to be this way. Over the last 20 years, I've had the privilege to work with some of the world's top performers in sports ranging from road cycling to alpine skiing to motorsport, including in Formula One. However, the focus of my work and research is on the workplace. And my real passion is providing people with science-based strategies that reveal a future where well-being fuels business success. Now, I am a scientist, but this is more than just theory. There was a fantastic study done just last year where a group of researchers looked at something called the Highest Wellbeing Places to Work Index. And they took the 100 companies that are in that index and constructed a hypothetical basket of those stocks. And they found that if you compared the performance of those top 100 wellbeing companies against the S&P 500, it outperformed the S&P 500 by 20 percentage points. Now, I haven't been always quite so fascinated by the S&P 500. In fact, about 20 years ago, I moved to the south of France and tried to pursue my dream of becoming a professional cyclist. Back then, that was the only pathway. We didn't have things like the Olympic Development Programme. If you wanted to try and make it as a professional road cyclist, you packed your bags, which I did at the age of 19, and moved to the continent. It was an incredible experience. You can see in this photo, this is actually from the Pyrenees, near to where I was based at the time. And I was so committed to realising my dream, to exploring my potential. But I was convinced that the secret to me reaching my potential was simply putting in more effort. My belief was based on putting in more effort in the hope that that might help me to get better results. Unfortunately, I got a pretty rude awakening because I found that more effort rather than leading to better results ended up with me experiencing a pretty bad case of overtraining. That overtraining probably was related to under-recovering, and as a consequence of that, my performance was really impaired. Now, fortunately, I'm quite a curious guy. I had a bit of a scientific background, so I ended up being a very early adopter of different scientific training methods, of wearable devices and technologies. Any cyclists in the room here might be familiar with things like power meters and heart rate monitors, to try to understand how I could make the most of my potential in a way that wouldn't compromise my health in the process. I learnt an incredibly important lesson during this time. The first was that rather than just throwing my effort around and trying to work harder in a mindless way, I needed to try and characterize my training and build it around deliberate effort. Deliberate effort in this case meant not leaving my training and its structure to chance. It meant having a clear structure for the intensity and the duration of my training. Secondly, perhaps most importantly, I needed to combine that deliberate effort with proactive recovery. Now, often when we think about recovery, we think about just stopping work, right? We think about reducing demands. But proactive recovery is slightly different. This is about actually doing things proactively which restore us, that help to replenish us. And I realized that if I was able to combine that deliberate effort with that proactive recovery, that formed the basis for achieving sustainable high performance. And in my case, this meant that I got some results. I started to experience more of my potential, and perhaps most importantly, I didn't compromise my health in the process. Now, unfortunately, my cycling career didn't quite reach the heights that I hoped. If I was honest with myself, I was probably more of a scientist than I was a cyclist. So I went back to the UK, I enrolled in university again. I studied a subject called sport and exercise science, and then, like many failed athletes, I set up my own coaching business. Now, many of the people that I worked with during this time were amateurs. I had a few clients who were professionals, who were elite riders, but the bread and the butter, the foundation of my coaching business, was a very unusual bunch of people. I was based in London at the time. These people were management consultants, finance professionals, technology workers, and for some reason, in addition to working for 80 hours a week, they decided to go and ride their bikes for 180 kilometers at the weekend. So I became a performance coach to these knowledge workers, and I started to realize that unless I could somehow account for the load associated with their working life, I couldn't plan their physical training effectively. And in the end, I began to conceptualize the work that they did from Monday to Friday, 80 hours a week, as a cognitive activity, as a kind of cognitive performance. And I began to see that these people were a kind of blend of a cognitive and physical athlete. However, there was so much that I needed to learn to understand about this world. I needed to be able to measure and understand what was going on in knowledge work. So I started to combine tools and frameworks from my training as a sports scientist, but also tools from physiology and neuroscience to try and understand what was going on. And this led me to a question that continues to fascinate me. What on earth is going on in knowledge workers' brains? Well, before we explore that question, I've got a question for you. Have you ever said to yourself, I feel like my brain is going at 1,000,000 miles an hour? Sound familiar? I think many of us can relate to that. Well, I'm going to disappear off stage again because I've got a device here that can actually measure what is going on in our brain. So this, if you could peer in and see, it's called an EEG headset. Basically, it can measure the electrical activity of your brain. There's 14 channels in this headset. If I turn it on, and try and fit it to my head and position it and mess up my hair, then I should be able to acquire a signal. There's these saline-soaked pads, 14 of them, and it's picking up on the electrical activity of my scalp. And the amazing thing is that electrical activity can be broken down into brainwave frequencies, which if I switch this software over and if it works okay, we should be able to see. There we go. So each of these lines represents a channel from this EEG headset, patterns of the electrical activity in my brain. And we can convert that data into brainwave frequency bands from slow to fast. So if I switch screens, you can see some slow waves, some theta waves, going into slightly faster alpha waves. And then we've got this very important beta brainwave band, which I'm going to talk about a bit more in a moment. We've got low beta, high beta, and then you can see a few gamma waves popping up as well. It's interesting to see how it kind of spikes and changes when I kind of turn and look at it and pay a bit of attention. But this is all very interesting from a scientific point of view. I'm kind of measuring the speed of my brain. But I'm going to show you something else in a minute, more of a kind of artistic representation that can be quite informative. Before I do that though, I just want to give you a quick kind of 101 on brainwave frequencies. So the slowest waves that we often see are in this delta brainwave frequency band. Hopefully you won't see any of these today. This is associated with deep sleep. Hopefully you won't see any deep sleepers in the audience either. Maybe I should have put some headsets on all of you and we could keep everyone honest. But we're going to move from the delta waves into slightly faster theta waves. We see theta waves associated with relaxation, with meditation, with creativity. Faster still, and if you notice these colours are starting to get a bit warmer, that'll be important in a moment. We've got alpha waves. We see alpha waves when we're in a calm state, maybe if you're taking a break, for example. Then faster still, warmer still, we've got beta waves. This is the kind of dominant brainwave frequency for our normal waking state. But if you remember back to that previous screen, those beta brainwave frequencies are kind of split into two bands. Low beta, when we're kind of calm and engaged. High beta, when we're actually starting to get stressed. And then we've got gamma waves. We probably won't see too many of those, but warmer still, we see this associated with higher order mental activities. Now, I'm going to switch to another piece of software now, and you'll be able to see my brain activity in real time. But these brainwave frequencies are going to be represented as different colours, cool to warm. Okay. So here you can see a representation of my brain activity. And a whole cascade of these quite cool kind of alpha into beta waves. What happens if I try and make myself a little bit stressed? Yeah, you can start to see some of this kind of red, the high beta. If I maybe try and think about something that makes me laugh, you might see a bigger cascade of activity. But a lot of the activity is focused around the front part of my brain, the prefrontal cortex. You can think about this as the control center of the brain, a part of the brain that I'm particularly interested in. Because as knowledge workers, that's part of our brain which is responsible for so many of the tasks that we engage in during the average day. And the amazing thing is that we can use this technology to measure what is going on during the workday and understand how to structure the workday in a way that will support both well-being and performance. So those factors, rather than being in conflict with each other, start to be complementary. There's some really interesting research into this, and in addition to kind of measuring and representing it in this artistic way, we can also record brain activity continually and understand, for example, when people are paying attention. So you can see now another representation of my brain activity, attention at the top. So you'll notice a kind of spike over to the right-hand side, which was associated with this demonstration starting. There's a bit of a delay in this representation. You'll also notice a bit of a peak of stress. So you see this purple line, it says ST, right down at the bottom. Look at that spike there, about 110. When I started this demonstration, I was panicking about whether this headset was actually going to work and connect, and thankfully it did. Otherwise, maybe you'd see smoke coming out of it or something. But my point being, we can actually use technology like this to get an insight into the day to support both well-being and performance. And honestly, I think many of us would probably agree, we need it, right? Well-being is a challenge. Again, we can pull data from software and we can see that overlapping meeting invitations, have increased by about 46%. The net result of this is that we're doing more back-to-back meetings, and as a result of that, we're taking fewer breaks. Now, I'm going to share some research from someone else who's also used one of these EEG headsets. I'm just going to put this out of the way for a moment, and we can see what's actually been going on when we don't take breaks between meetings. So this is another piece of data, it's another representation of brain activity during the day where knowledge workers didn't take a break between meetings. And so what you see when people don't take a break is this higher beta brainwave activity. And if you remember from just a few slides ago, that's associated with higher negative stress, even with anxiety. But we also see that when people don't take a break between meetings, there's a phenomenon called negative frontal alpha asymmetry. I'm going to test you on this at the end. But essentially, this indicates lower engagement in the meetings. So the simple story from this quite complex piece of research is that when we don't take breaks between meetings, we see reduced well-being, but also worse performance. But as I started to explore this question, what is going on in a knowledge worker's brain, this led me to a second question. What is performance in knowledge work anyway? It's quite a challenge because the problem with knowledge work is that there's often no single correct answer. There's no one way to complete the task that we're engaged in. And it can be quite difficult to measure the outcomes. What is productivity in knowledge work? Fortunately, some great researchers have explored this question for me. There was a study done a few years ago in almost 190,000 people in over 80 companies around the world. And they described how 4 key capabilities are critical for performance in knowledge work. The first group of capabilities relates to what we describe as diverse insights. This means identifying trends and seeking different perspectives. Secondly, productive efficiency. This is about working efficiently and productively to achieve results. Thirdly, problem solving. Pretty self-explanatory, solving problems effectively. Fourthly, emotional intelligence. This means being a leader who creates supportive and emotionally intelligent environments to work in. It relates to our social intelligence, our ability to relate effectively with each other. I'd also add a couple of other capabilities onto this. Other complementary research has highlighted the importance of analytical judgment. This relates to precision in evaluation and decision making, and also creative thinking. And in this case, I'd define it as innovating beyond conventional boundaries. But if we just zoom in on those first 4 capabilities for a moment, the researchers concluded after looking at these 190,000 people that 89% of the difference in performance between strong and weak organizations in terms of their leadership effectiveness was explained by those first 4 capabilities. Unfortunately, when I started to measure performance in knowledge work through this lens, I observed a very familiar dysfunctional pattern, one that I'd seen 20 years earlier when I was a cyclist. It was a pattern that was characterized by overwork, under-recovering, and those capabilities were fundamentally compromised. This particular chart shows a data set that I gathered in some of the highest performing companies around the world. And in this particular study, I was measuring the relationship between their average sleep as a population and their cognitive performance. Now, you can see the blue bars represent sleep, the grey line represents cognitive performance. And when I processed this data and started to visualize it, one thing really leapt out to me. Consistently across this group, the lowest cognitive performance followed the shortest night of sleep. Now, it's not just me who's observed this relationship. There's many studies that describe it. But did you know that working long days, so that means working more than 55 hours per week, increases the risk of disrupted sleep by more than 200%? And again, when we don't sleep enough, those fundamental cognitive capabilities that explain so much of the difference in performance between strong and weak organizations start to get impaired. For example, when we don't sleep enough, problem-solving ability decreases by around 60%. There was another really interesting study where they looked at how much sleep debt leaders had. And they found that when leaders carried higher sleep debt, that was associated with worse psychological safety among their teams. And that was likely related to the leaders not being as emotionally intelligent, perhaps snapping at people. I'm sure that many of us can relate to this. Sometimes we manage to hold it together during the workday, but when we've not slept enough, it's often the people closest to us who get the worst of us. Not sleeping enough also has an impact on our IQ. There was a really influential piece of research that found that if we were to sleep for 6 hours per night for 2 weeks, cognitive performance declined, equivalent to going about 2 nights without sleep. And you could represent that as a drop in performance equivalent to 15 IQ points. The interesting thing about this piece of research, though, was that they also measured how sleepy and impaired people felt. And quite curiously, even though people's cognitive performance had dropped equivalent to dropping 15 IQ points, people's perception was that they weren't that much more sleepy or impaired than if they'd slept for 8 hours per night. See, unfortunately, we're quite poor judges of how inadequate sleep affects us. And as a result of that, for many of us, kind of impaired performance has become a kind of new normal. As a result, for leaders, I think this is a particular challenge. Sometimes I describe something called the leadership paradox, and essentially it describes how leadership demands can impair a leader's ability to lead. Those high demands, those long working hours, which are often part of the job, end up compromising those fundamental capabilities that explain so much of the difference between strong and weak leadership. So, what is the solution? Well, I'm convinced from my work and research over nearly 2 decades now that we need to approach knowledge work, that's work where we think for a living, as a cognitive endurance activity. In practice, this means that we can apply some very similar principles that I used to apply in the context of athletic performance to endurance athletes in the context of knowledge work. It begins with deliberate effort. This means not leaving how we deploy effort to chance. It means having a clear structure for intensity and duration. Secondly, again, perhaps most importantly, we need proactive recovery. It's about so much more than just removing demands. It's about intentional rest and restoring energy. And I've seen consistently that if you combine deliberate effort with proactive recovery, it forms the basis for sustainable high performance. And in this case, it means that we can improve well-being as well as support business success. But now I've shared all this data with you, I'm sure you're not surprised to hear that proactive recovery has to start with adequate quality sleep. And the bad news is, I'm afraid, for the vast majority of people, unless you've got a very rare genetic mutation on the DEC2 gene, that means we've got to sleep for 7 hours per night. But it's not just about sleep, right? We also need a framework to help us to work smarter. And in practice, I like to conceptualize this as upgrading our mental operating system.